Hello and welcome back to the ChatGPT for Beginners course. Let's talk about an advanced topic, an important session. We're talking about tokens, token limits, and context windows. Let me warn you up front, this session will be a little bit more technical, but I really urge you to go through the entire session if you really want to get the most out of using ChatGPT. Because if you go through the session, or maybe rewatch it later because it's a bit hard to go through at once, you will really improve your outputs and your results that you get with ChatGPT. All right, so let's dive in. What are tokens, token limits, and context window? Tokens are the basic unit of processing information in any AI model, including GPT 3.5 and GPT-4. So that means when you enter a prompt into ChatGPT, maybe it is 100 words, maybe it is 400 words, but that the length of that input is measured in tokens. And the amount of tokens that this makes up is also influenced by words and a punctuation. And tokens are important because of the token limit. Think about yourself as a human being, or let's say we have a conversation, okay? And I talk for 3 minutes straight to you about this concept. I don't take any breaks and I just keep talking, right? It will probably be too much for you at once because just like a human being, also AI can only process a certain amount of information at once. So that amount of information to be processed at once can be measured in tokens, and we call it the token limit. And what is also important is that the token limit kind of consists of input and output, right? Because if you give ChatGPT an input, you want an output. And if your input is very long, then your output may be very short, because then you already run into the token limit. Or if your input is already beyond the token limit, then ChatGPT will not be able to give you any output, and you're going to get this error message. All right. If your input is longer than the token limit, you will get this error message and you don't get an output. So in that case, you need a shorter prompt to get an actual output, because the token limit is calculated by input plus output. So that means, let's say we have 4,000 token limit with GPT 3.5. If your prompt has a decent size, your response can be a decent size, and together the deep will run into the token limit. If you have a short prompt, then you can get a longer response. But if you have a very long prompt, then a response can only be short. Basically, the processing ability of the AI model is not only busy processing your input, it's also busy processing its own output, right? So if most of the capabilities already spent processing your input, then there is not a lot of attention left to create an output. That's how you have to think about it. And what happens in the error I just showed you is, if your prompt is too long, then, well, if it's too long, then it cannot even generate a response. Or if your prompt is very long, it could also happen that ChatGPT starts with an output, but then in the middle of it stops because it has run into the limit, and then your output fails. So the idea is, if you understand token and token limits, you also understand that the length and detail of response you get strongly depends on your prompt or on your input. You connect it to this, but a separate idea is the idea of a context window. And the context window describes basically that part of your conversation with ChatGPT that ChatGPT can actually remember. Remember, the amazing thing with ChatGPT is you can have a meaningful conversation because it remembers the context of your conversation, and it remembers what you're talking about in one conversation window. However, if your conversation gets too long, at some point, ChatGPT will no longer be able to remember the entire conversation. It will only remember less parts of the conversation you had, okay? So keep that in mind as you talk or interact with ChatGPT. On the idea of tokens. So one token is roughly 4 to 5 characters. But this is a general rule of thumb, and you cannot always say that clearly because tokens depend on the amount of words, on the length of the words, and also on the punctuation. So here is just one example I found online, and in that case, 40 tokens were about 204 characters. But keep in mind that this also includes empty spaces. All right, that's why we say 4 to 5. So, what do you need to know? GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 have different token limits and context windows. GPT 3.5, which you have access to as a ChatGPT 3 user, has 4,096 tokens as a token limit or context window. GPT 4 has double that, which is 8,192. In short, that means GPT-4 can take longer prompts as input and also give longer outputs. Moreover, because the context window is longer, it can stay on topic longer because it remembers more of the conversation that you had, which is, of course, generally, this is another strong reason why I recommend you to invest into ChatGPT Plus and pay the $20 a month it currently costs. So, how do token limits work? Again, keep in mind, just like the human brain, a large language model has a limit to the amount of information it can process at once. If you input more tokens than the token limit, the LLM will show an error. Again, this is this error here. And the token limit consists of both input and output. All right? That is why the longer your input, the shorter your output. If you want a long output, try to keep the input rather short. By the way, you can, of course, always go back and ask ChatGPT to go into more detail based on its previous output, so you can still get a longer output in a later stage, right? You have the token limit, and then, depending on the length of your prompt, that will also determine the length of your response or output. To keep that in mind, it is important to understand how ChatGPT remembers something, right? Because ChatGPT has a memory, which it makes it the amazing tool that it is, because you can have a real conversation with someone or something that remembers you and the context of our conversation. Let's say we start a new conversation with ChatGPT. You enter your user, you enter a prompt, and ChatGPT gives you an output. And then let's say you give a new prompt based on that because you continue the conversation. In that case, ChatGPT will use the entire previous chat history. So it will use your last prompt with the previous conversation and input that into the large language model in order to give you a response. That's a very technical way of saying, just imagining the two of us have a conversation, okay? And as we continue to talk, my answer will not only be based on the last thing you asked me or the last thing you told me, but it will be based on the entire context of our conversation. That's naturally how conversations flow, right? And that's beautiful because that means basically just that ChatGPT remembers the context. However, at some point, our conversation has been going on for so long that I cannot consider our entire conversation in the next response that I give to you. And it's the same for ChatGPT. At some point, our conversation has been going on for too long, and I only remember the more recent parts of our conversation. I probably don't remember the beginning. That is why you need to consider the context window, okay? If you imagine that here we have a long conversation with ChatGPT, the context window describes The green part here is, okay, ChatGPT still remembers this part of the conversation. But if your conversation is longer than the context window, there will be parts of the conversation that ChatGPT has forgotten. The longer your conversation with ChatGPT gets, the less precise its answers can be. Or a better way to put it is, if your conversation has been going on for too long, then maybe your response will no longer be very precise exactly because ChatGPT has forgotten the beginning of the conversation. So, what are the implications of all of this? The first one is, don't make your prompt or input longer than it must be. Okay, but maybe it has to be very long because you want to be very precise and tell ChatGPT exactly kind of what you're writing about or the output that you need. Okay. In that case, you can always go back. ChatGPT can only author around 400 words, but you can always ask it the next prompt to expand on a section with another 400 words, right? Like roughly 400 words. So I want you to consider this idea of chunking up and chunking down. That basically means ChatGPT can write at different levels of detail. And you can start high level and then ask it to expand in more detail on a section and then expanding even more detail on that section. And to me, it's kind of like Google Maps. You know, when you have the Google Map on your smartphone, you zoom in, you zoom out. That is kind of how you can work with ChatGPT, because maybe it gets, let's say it gets too specific. You can then also ask it to summarize this or to make it more high level. So if you want to write a really long text, let's say you want a blog post of 1,000 words, you cannot get that in one output. You can only get an output of 400 words. So you prompt it, you want to have a blog post about a certain topic, then it gives you the whole thing in 400 words. Okay? Now, those 400 words can certainly be divided into various sections of the blog post. So in the next step, you just say, okay, great, ChatGPT, now please expand in more detail on this section of the blog post, right? And then it will give you a longer version of that part. And if you still want to have more detail of that part, you can just, again, you'll say, please ChatGPT expand in more detail on this section of this section. Okay? So you chunk down, you zoom in, and you get more detail and more detail in your outputs. And of course, in your prompt, you should tell ChatGPT exactly which part of its previous output you want to have detailed further. And that is how you can go into longer text if you want to have blog posts or even entire books. You don't have to do everything in one prompt. In fact, you can't do everything in one prompt. All right, so just summarize this. Your input is measured in tokens. The output is measured in tokens. If the input and output is too long, you run into the token limit. And if you run into the token limit, you get this error message and you can't go further. So you have to go back, take a shorter prompt to get an actual output. And if the output you want is not detailed enough, just ask ChatGPT to detail it further. The longer you talk with ChatGPT, the higher the risk that it does not remember the whole conversation that you have, because at some point your conversation is longer than the context window. Okay?